I wish I didn't know that fact, Joe. I was just about to look something up and I completely forgot. Hopefully it wasn't important.
Wait until the door until actual
Yeah, 10 o'clock. Yeah.
or 10 o'clock. Yeah.
I wonder if they can give us the recordings, the video recordings. I mean, not that they'll necessarily need to do anything with them, but I wouldn't mind having them
Yeah.
just for like nostalgia purposes, you know.
Hmm.
You have to be like, look at me, I was on TV.
Well, I think they're posting them on YouTube, so we can go to the.
Oh,
So we'd actually share links.
okay.
When we post the episodes, we can share links to the YouTube.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, shall we?
It's not 10 o'clock yet, Tracy. Stop
It's
trying to.
true. Everybody having a good con? Huh? I was about to do that. Yeah. Everybody having a good con so far? Yeah. So the faces I don't recognize, I assume y'all are Wicked and Devine fans. Awesome.
Yeah, those guys are our friends.
They might be fans too.
Kinda. It's like when your mom buys your CD. Well, I mean, that's fair.
We appreciate the moral support.
Yeah, I mean, we're very thankful for you being here. We love you guys. We still got 30 seconds, Tracy. Stop jumping the gun.
But I'm excited.
Yeah, that's true. I'm super nervous, as you can probably tell. I'm the nervous one, and Tracy's always like, "It's fine, it's fine."
I have anxiety about other things.
And I am not a fan of being in front of crowds. I do it when we need to, but that's a good thing about podcasting is like we're like half the time we're just like in my living room. So if I screw up, I'm like, "Oh my God, Tracy, just edit that out."
I edit so much out. Okay.
Yeah, this
Okay.
one time I had this big rant on the podcast. We were talking about stuff, and I went on this like rant, and I was like, "Oh my God, Tracy, you got to edit that out." He was like, "I am not editing that out." He left like half the rant in.
Okay. Is this mic picking up? Okay. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. So I guess to get started, for those of you not familiar with the podcast, I'm Tracy, and
I'm Robyn.
and so we have a podcast called Diversity Issues. Basically, the idea is we love indie comics, and um, we also like to support diversity, inclusion, representation of marginalized groups. Well, in general, but specifically, we wanted to focus on for the podcast indie comics, and part of that is because indie comics have been the leader in diversity and representation. I mean, you're seeing a lot of stuff way before it hits the big two in indie comics. You know, more gay characters, more trans characters, lots of
More people of color. Yeah, yeah.
Good representation of women.
Yeah, and a lot of times, like you were saying, the gatekeeping isn't there. You know, with the big two, you have, decades long histories of, of lore that they're trying to tap into. Whereas with indie comics, you can tell a fresh, original story. You don't have to worry about someone telling you like, "Oh my God, why did you make my Superman black?" or something like that.
Yeah, and so this all started where members of a group fan group and part of the leadership team called Color of Fandom, which is out of the Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina area, where we had kind of done some panels with them, and we still do panels with them, and kind of in doing that, this idea was born out of that. So
Yeah.
I guess
We just realized, like, we talked to each other about comics so much. We were like, we should record this and make other people listen to us.
yeah. So we got a little bit of bookkeeping.
Yeah. So, as you guys already realized, this is a live recording. So at the end, we'll have, open audience participation. So by commenting, you are basically consenting to being recorded, and you acknowledge that that recording will be shared publicly on our podcast. We do have this catch box. So once we start that, we'll pass that so people can make comments. There will be spoilers, of course, but you guys are already fans, so you probably already know what's going on. We do ask that everyone be respectful of us as the host, of fellow participants, and of the creators of the works in your commenting. We'd really appreciate that.
Okay, so I guess I'll start, and we're gonna do a little intro for the actual podcast. We'll post online. So, hey folks, we're here at DragonCon 2019, and we are excited to talk about the comic "The Wicked and the Divine."
Yeah, so it's by Kieran Gillen.
Yep.
I forget who the artist is. I should look that up. We usually look that up. We're not used. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Matt Wilson is here actually, the colorist.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, the basic premise of the story is that every 90 years, uh, various deities are reincarnated as young people, but they will die within 2 years, or so they're told. The catch, though, is that they basically have all of their memories and all the personality of the people that they were before they obtain these powers. So, Wicked and Divine is really a story in many ways about fandom. It's a story about idolatry. It's kind of a murder mystery. In the characterization, the representation is varied, and it kind of stands out in its subtlety because there is so much of it. Why is representation in this manner important?
I mean, there's all kinds of different reasons why representation is important. For one thing, it's like if you're from a marginalized group, if you're from a minority group, it's great to have a work where you can see yourself, where you can see people like you, people with experiences like you.
Yeah. For me, I think the big thing, though, about this representation in particular is the subtlety of it. Because the characters are just who they are. And, stories, particularly, they are having a good time over there. uh, Stories about individual experiences as a marginalized person are incredibly important. But there are also times when, being a person of a marginalized community, you just want to be able to be a person. And in this story, it's kind of like with the cookie metaphor that C.B. Lee made in the relationships panel the other day. When there's only 2 cookies on the plate, if somebody takes one of those cookies away, you're gonna notice. But if there are like 15 cookies, somebody takes away a cookie, it's just there. And so in that, these characters just get to be who they are. You get to appreciate them for who they are, and you get to really read the story, and it becomes more about who they are as people and how they connect to each other, as opposed to some think piece about what their identity is.
Yeah, and
Those are important, though, but I think you need a variety. You know what I mean? You need all types of stories.
well, and I like the idea of the sometimes subtlety, but it's subtle, but also it's clearly defined, and I think it's a good normalizer for people too. For one thing, I noticed in Wicked and Divine, there's a lot of diversity of characters who are bi or pan, and I mean, that's a group that they can be. They're kind of on the defensive sometimes from both the straight and the gay community, and in this book, it's not an issue. It's very normalizing in that regard. And there's, like I said, among the gods, we've got several.
Yeah. Another thing for me and we've talked about it before on the podcast, that's kind of a big deal is how the characters are colored. A lot of times, especially with darker skinned black characters, there's not a lot of representation there. They're always, lighter skin. And with Persephone's character, with Baal's character, with Inanna, it's obvious that these are people of color. To me, it's kind of bothersome when in the art of a comic, a person's is like ambiguous and they try to use that as like, oh, that's good enough, you can figure out what it is. It's kind of like the whole concept of queer baiting in a way. It's kind of like where you're trying to figure out, it's like, no, make these people's identities, make them, if they're people of color, make them people of color.
Yeah, and I think props definitely go there for the colorist, because the way he's coloring this comic, I mean, I think it's a lot of bright and bold colors and a lot of stark contrasts, and it really, I think, helps to that enables him to do what you're saying.
Yeah, and a lot of so I read these in trade and collected format as opposed to the single issues. But one thing, like, they have the cover galleries in the back, and one of the things that I did notice, because that's a big pet peeve of mine that we've talked about before, when you have like variant covers and things like that, when a different artist portrayal of a certain character and they'll like lighten the character's skin, and I'm just like, why do you feel the need to do that? That's really a pet peeve of mine. And I'm not sure if it was, a conscious decision on the writers and or artists to be like, no, that's not what our characters look like. To say like they need to reflect what they are in the book.
Yeah, you mentioned the issues. I did read the last 6 in single issue because they're not in a trade yet. How many people are up to speed? Okay. So, because
we won't spoil too
much. The last
Don't spoil too
issue
bad.
is coming out September 4th, and I'm just dying.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of big things have happened, wrapping it up, and so it's kind of a final wrap-up issue. So, a lot of big things have already happened in the last few, but still.
Yeah.
Really exciting ending. So, wherever you're at, keep going. It's amazing right to the end.
Yeah. And you were talking before about like bi erasure. One other thing to me that was really kind of key with the subtlety of the representation and the normalization was, in the relationships with the characters, it made it less sensational in a lot of ways. Like when Persephone was with Sekhmet or whatever, then it was less about, ooh, this thing about like, ooh, 2 lesbians or whatever, 2 girls kissing. And it was just more about like Persephone can't get her shit together and not like cheat on her boyfriend, you know what I mean? It was just more about her as a character and as a person and what she was doing, and less about, reenacting a Katy Perry song or something.
Yeah. So, should we ask the audience what their favorite relationship is?
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, we were going to talk about, saving everything at the end, but
Tracy lied and cheated.
we can improv this a little bit. So, well, it's not scripted, but audience, any favorite relationships? Because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Okay. You got one?
Here, I'll just walk around.
Oops, sorry.
Basically, you're talking to this part. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a microphone with a speaker, so you talk into this part.
Yeah. So he's got one over there in the pink shirt.
Oh, here.
Oh, wow. It's really cool. One thing that I really liked, I think The Wicked and the Devine is sort of what introduced me to the to like asexual people. Like, I had never really like thought of that before or anything. And Dionysus is one of my favorite characters.
Oh, yes.
He's just a delight. So his relationship with Cass, that's a lesbian character who he's in love with, but because he realizes that she wouldn't want to be in a relationship with him, like, he just keeps it to himself, and he's, sort of says, like, part of being a good friend is me just, bottling up these feelings and trying to be the best friend for her that I can be. And that's sort of like, it ends up getting him killed, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, love
And
those two.
I love that point, and it's great that they had him in there, and they had that because it's like everybody else is so sexual, and then they have him, and they have the ace representation, and it doesn't degrade the character in any way.
Yeah.
In fact, he's just as full of a character as anybody else, and living just as full of a life. And
Yeah, I think that's it's also great that they had an ace character in general because, like you were saying, you don't get a lot of representation of ace characters, and a lot of people have a misconception of what an ace person is. They think that they like cannot fall in love, that they cannot be in love. We were at a different con, and there was a person that was kind of making comments about lamenting about being ace because they just were tired of like relationship woes, and we were kind of like, you can't just co-opt somebody's identity to kind of just lament with your life problems. That's not how you are an ally to a marginalized group.
giving up on relationships is not the same as not desiring to have sexual intercourse.
Right. Yep. Any other thoughts on relationships? Alrighty. So we can move on to the next point. So again, we were talking about relationships. What are some important points that are made in the storytelling, specifically about relationships, or really about anything else?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dionysus is, with him being ace. That's a great point. So, not to give away too much, they make some good points at the end about, I don't know, what it means to be a god, and we have some of the main characters that are, having realizations in that regard toward the end. I'm not gonna say where that leads them, but a lot of realizations about their self-perceptions in among the whole thing. It's kind of profound. And
Yeah. So Persephone, of course, is the point of view character. I really love the conversations that she has with the various characters about who they are as people. So there was one point where she and Inanna were having a conversation about when he cheated on Ball. And then it was funny too because Minerva was like, don't fracking cheat on Ball. He's already been through that. Basically telling Persephone, like, don't repeat this drama in Ball's life. But because one of the things that you and I always talk about, just in general, when we talk about like both open relationships and about poly relationships, is how communication is the key, And there was one line in there where Inanna was talking about how he wished that he had kind of handled that better, and he was talking about how like, why can't everybody just be like me and like be open or whatever, and it's like, it's possible, but you never actually had that conversation with him, what I
Yeah.
mean, and them coming to that realization that there are possibilities of what your partner may or may not have been willing to do, to try or whatever, but you never had that conversation with him.
Yeah, and also we get into I think there's a really big theme there about the ends justifying the means. Well, we have this dark force that
The Great Darkness.
The Great Darkness, yeah, that Anarchy is, telling them they prepare to fight, and they're encountering in some ways.
For the longest time, I think I like injected an N into her name. I always say it as Ananke when I read it, but that's probably wrong.
I have no idea how.
I don't know either.
Exactly,
I just
but,
know how to look at it.
That's how I read it. But and it's kind of like the things that she is claiming to do for those reasons, and the things she has certain other characters doing. It's like sacrificing a few to save the world, and it's like, Huh?
talk about.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
does do the end justify the means? I think is a powerful plot point.
yeah. Um, Another one too for me was when Persephone and Baphomet were talking about like just how they hurt people. It was almost like a compulsion for him, where he and the Morrigan, they're very complicated relationship where they're constantly hurting each other. And like reading that, I didn't even know what to make about it make a yeah, because I'm like reading it, and he realizes this, he comes to this realization. Yeah,
Oh,
it's
you're good.
okay. Yeah. But he comes to this realization that basically they're in a toxic relationship. But it's like, okay, what are you gonna do about it?
Well, yeah, he still choose. He's still once he realizes that, then he's still staying there, and it's like how many of us have had people close to us doing that, or even been there ourselves for too long.
Yeah. So there were a couple of times when some of the characters kind of surprised me in their comments, especially because, the characters in general seem to be of a mindset that is much more forward. So there was this one time where Laura said that she was surprised that Ball would be with a guy, and I was actually kind of surprised that she was surprised. I mean, just given this world that they had created and had built. I mean, in our world, I definitely can see people being surprised as about Ball being with a guy, especially being, you know, very open about it. Like, he had no problem admitting that, he's with a guy, he's in love with this guy, because there's definitely this stereotype about, you know, especially like around rappers, around black men, about like the hyper masculinity, of black men, and like the arrogance and things like that, and especially like with rappers and stuff like that. So I thought that was really kind of cool that they had that character be in love with being a bi character, and then being in a relationship where he was open about being with a guy, and no shame whatsoever.
Yeah, well, and with the hyper masculinity, it's well, is her surprise because so often it can happen where the guys are still engaging in that, it's just kind of on the down low. And
I mean, yeah, that's definitely a big thing. So yeah, it wasn't explained why she was surprised.
yeah.
I assumed that the surprise was just in general, because like, so when I first read this comic, I kind of like assigned the various characters to like real life pop stars. So Sakomet is obviously Rihanna. They even say it in like one of the panels, like Persephone's like, oh, I drew Sakomet, she looks like Rihanna. And Inanna is Prince, at least to me. I'm like, I feel like they're channeling Prince in that. And so for Ball, to me, I felt like they were kind of channeling Kanye, especially like earlier on, like when this comic like was first coming out, like in like 2015 and everything. Like, I mean, in some of the other characters, it's very obvious in the aesthetic, in the way that they're drawn in the face. Like Sakomet, in her face, she's drawn to look like Rihanna. And Laura, there's this actress, this British actress, Antonia Thomas. Like, she looks like that actress. And Inanna, a little bit in his face, he kind of looks like Prince, but his overall aesthetic to me reminds me of Prince.
Yeah, his overall aesthetic is definitely
Yeah.
very, maybe Prince with a little bit of David Bowie.
Yeah, yeah. But early on, just like more so like aesthetic, I thought they were kind of like channeling Kanye. So I wasn't sure if they made a deliberate choice to make him bi because of his controversial kind of like no homo comments.
Well, and that's interesting. I love the choice that they made Bale specifically by, because he is kind of the alpha male, and and he was not threatened by that. He was comfortable in that, and he wasn't worried about how people would perceive him because of that. Which, I mean, there's a lot of that with they've got these powers, they've got the fame, they've got a limited amount of time. There's a lot of well, the rules change for you. There's just things you throw out the window and don't worry about.
Yeah, but even aside from that, just his personality, he seemed like the kind of, and he seemed like even in normal life that he would be fine with that. There was this in one of the side one shots or whatever, they go over his initial kind of like coming together with Inanna, like when he realized that they liked each other and everything, and he openly said he was like, I'm attracted to you, but I didn't know what that meant, and he was like, well, if you like me, you like me. Let's get it on. And I kind of thought that was just a lot of the ways that they allowed Ball's character to be kind of like, this very masculine, very arrogant, especially like the arrogance around his character. I feel like that's part of the reason why Laura said that she was kind of surprised about it, because of like the arrogance around his masculinity. But the fact that they allowed a character that kind of embodied that to also be, a bisexual character, and then also his relationship with Minerva. He becomes kind of the caregiver for her, so it's kind of like the most vulnerable of them. He is, he's this, hyper masculine character, and when you think of like just gender roles in which you assume that the man is not going to be taken care of, the family taking care of kids, the man's going to be like, no, I'm the man, you're the woman, blah blah blah. And so you have this hyper masculine character who's also bisexual, who's also a caregiver, but also very masculine. I felt like that was a very poignant point to be making in this comment, and just subtle. It's just like there.
Yeah, and I like how also, like, with the bi characters, that they're not. It's not a temporary thing for any of them. It's not like they're choosing. I mean, we see them having attractions both ways, and at the same time, and
Yeah.
it's not like a phase that anybody's going through.
So one of the other characters, though, Amaterasu. So she kind of was a little shisty. I know that's a made up word. I'm gonna use it anyway. So in the beginning, I don't even know what she's kind of doing. Like, I understand what it is, but I don't like have a term for it. But so I can't remember exactly how the conversation went, but there was some conversation around, her sexuality, and she says to Laura, "Oh, I'm the boring one," basically meaning that she's het. And then later on, they find out that she's actually bi, and so I'm kind of like, and Laura's like, "You said you're the boring one. What the hell's on with this?" And so they didn't have more of a conversation around it. But I kind of feel like that's another thing that is an issue amongst, like, the cis community, especially like hyper feminine cis women or whatever, where you kind of like play at this, "Oh, I'm so cutesy, oh, I saw this and that," you know what I mean? And it kind of felt like that was what Amaterasu was doing, and it's like they don't go into her motivations behind it, so I'm not really sure where that was coming from for her as a person, but it felt very real. It felt like something that like a person today would do, where it's like you kind of pretend that, like, that you're not bisexual, because, like, are you embarrassed about it? Do you think it's like I wasn't sure what that was with her.
We're all good.
And I like the point that you're making there. Like, in the depths of their godhood, we also see their humanity. They're still people. They still are vulnerable. They still have well, they have flaws all along.
Yeah, because I mean, ultimately, because they don't lose any of their memories of who they are. So essentially, even though they are now deities, they're basically like trash humans with powers at that point. You know what I mean? They don't forget who they were. They don't lose any of their personality characteristics. They still do the things that they would have done before. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times, Laura has powers, but she's still, you know, a very anxious person, a very nervous person, a very self-conscious person. Ball has powers, but he still, struggles with, his toxic relationship with the Morrigan. Inanna has powers, but he's still, trying to figure out, his like how he wants to live his life. You know what I mean? Woden still has powers, but he's still a dirtbag trash person.
Yeah, well, and I had a hard time in the first couple of volumes liking any of the characters because I mean, and I kind of think probably what a lot of people go through, like you hit that kind of power in your teens, early 20s, and you're not going to use it responsibly. You're going to, you know, and they all have to grow up pretty quick, and
Yeah.
um,
I don't want to give too many spoilers based on that point, but so let's kind of divert and talk about Woden for a second because like you said, when people, especially as young people come into, certain powers, certain responsibilities, how they handle them, and Woden's like the perfect example of like cis white male privilege in everything he does. He basically uses his powers to manipulate people, but he still kind of feels like, woe is me. He's the one that, didn't get he got the short end of the stick. And then, like, his whole, Valkyrie squad thing is.
he is so easy to hate, though.
I mean, he's a trash person. He's disgusting.
And
I mean, he openly fetishizes Asian women, and he's like, well, they want us, so I'm like, okay.
yeah, and he's also a bootlicker
What? What do you mean by that?
with Anarchy.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
well, and but we find out she has some leverage with him.
Yeah. But again, to your point, that I mean, it doesn't change anything though. You know what I mean? It's like for him, his ultimate goal is amassing and retaining power. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he understands that Anaki could take power from him at any moment on her whim. And so he does what she wants him to do, not out of any sense of loyalty, not out of any sense of, helping the rest of the Pantheon, but basically because she's the HBIC, so I'm going to do what she says. But if he had an opportunity to subvert her at any given point, he would do it.
Yeah, well, and I mean,
No question.
He's an opportunist, so, well, first of all, he doesn't have a line too far, it seems. So he's willing to do whatever he needs to do to stay near power. And
He doesn't have a line. He's got like a jump rope. He's always.
And then he's an opportunist. So if that window does open where he could betray her and take power, he'd absolutely do it.
I mean, he straight up admitted to it. Like when I forget Brunhilde, when he basically puts Brunhilde in the hospital, he says like the Prometheus myth doesn't exist because if it did, I would have done it. I mean, he's got like no shame in admitting that he's basically like a trash person, but he knows that he has this power, so he's basically like, what you gonna do? So
Yeah.
Yeah. So should we ask the audience like who their character?
Sure.
characters are?
We could do favorite and most hated.
Yeah. Okay. So, what are your guys' thoughts? We have the catch box that our lovely assistant Karen will toss to you.
And you can
Any
filter and
thoughts
throw it at
on?
people.
Yeah. So, any thoughts on
It won't hurt people. You can throw it at them.
either your favorite character or the most relatable character, or a character that speaks to you for whatever reason. Like, it doesn't have to be a character that you like, but a character that speaks for you for whatever particular reason. Like, for example, like Baphomet. Like, I couldn't stand his ass at first, but then when he kind of broke down with Persephone, like when they had that breakdown moment, and they were just talking about like how they just could not figure out why they couldn't stop doing what they were doing. I just really felt for them in that moment, you know what I mean? In a way that, I still don't like him as a person, you know what I mean? But him being able to know that about himself and at least acknowledge that, really kind of made me feel something for him. Any thoughts? Anybody? Dang, y'all so quiet. Okay, oh, she's got one.
I don't throw. Good, because I don't catch. So we haven't talked very much about Tara. So I always thought that her
Girl, yes.
situation was very interesting, just because she was really self-aware. So no, I don't agree with her decision for how she handled her disappointment with everyone's expectations. Like, she could have just said, fuck you. Oh, sorry, I don't.
Oh, no.
Oh, I got a potty mouth like you wouldn't believe. I love it.
I can't edit out everything. Not with her.
But she could have just decided that, all of those pressures on the outside didn't mean anything to her, but she didn't. But she also realized that she was responding to those pressures, and I thought that was unique, because it didn't seem like, well, it doesn't seem like most other characters realize their motivations, right? Just like you said with Baphomet and Laura, they don't know why they treat people badly. But Tara knew exactly what her issue was with the world, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I'm glad you brought up Tara. So it's funny how part of her arc as a character, I mean, she doesn't even really have an arc, right? Part of the whole thing about her as a character is that she as a person is overlooked because of her beauty and because of her body. And so then in the story, she's also being overlooked. You know what I mean? Every other character in the pantheon gets, they get a full arc. They get to be kind of fleshed out. She's not even like a supporting character. Like, literally, she doesn't drive the plot at all. So you have this character, and you're kind of making this point about, women being objectified, and then you don't even give her like, real autonomy in the story. I think that's probably one of the only kind of points that kind of fell flat for me in the writing. I was like, I don't get why the character, you know what I mean, that you're making this point with, basically she has no autonomy in the story. She has no arc whatsoever.
Right. I think we had another one in the back.
Yeah, in the pink shirt.
One of my favorite characters is Lucy, definitely. The sort of the first, the character who grabs Laura into this whole thing, and then gets killed early, and then comes back at the end to have some more hijinks. And it's her nature, her like sense of rebellion. And there's even like a prequel chapter where you see her before she ascended, and she's very like, like she has her attitude, and like she's very rebellious. And I think like you see that in the choices that she makes towards the end. And one thing that I love her for is she spends a lot of like the back half of the series like with her mouth sewn up, and like the moment she they open her mouth, she says a very significant thing that like she says like the 3 words that are exactly the information that she needed to pass on to Laura and the rest of the good guys. So and so's the bad guy. She did all this, and it's great. That directness is just it's needed.
And she is an amazing character, and it's more so than I think anyone else. Like, she fully embraces her godhood and what she sees as her role, and not as a heroic figure, but as the rebellious figure, as the
Yeah. I think the other thing too about her as a character, and kind of like the perfect embodiment of Lucifer, and especially like with I mean, honestly, we have like freedom of religion, but the majority of this country, believes in Christianity, but like most people's like connection to a Lucifer uh, deity, where it's like, you place your blames and your troubles, on this deity, and Lucifer kind of exists, in this way where she's like, I'm doing these things, but honestly, I'm not pushing the ball forward. People around me are, I'm doing what I want to do. I'm, living, my life in the way that I want to and that I see fit. And whether or not you personally could deem how she lives her life as like right or wrong, kind of like you were saying in the beginning, how she just, is there doing her thing, you know, that to me, I felt like she was like really like a great embodiment of like how our real relationship is with like a Lucifer character. And then too, like you said, especially with her like putting the truth out there, that's kind of another thing where it's like, the whole kind of thought of like sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing too, like, and for that vital piece of information to come from a Lucifer character, it's kind of cool.
So do we have any other thoughts? Any other people who really a character really connected with you or spoke with you? Oh, got a couple more in the front.
Oh, this thing is kind of nifty.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
We have the
We got a catch
cash
box
box.
that's moving around. So
Oh, I can just give it to you.
You can go ahead and go.
Okay. Well, all right. I love them all. I love them and I hate them all. Oh my God.
You speak up a little bit.
or
I'm sorry.
talking to the box a little more.
I love them and I hate them all at the same time. So it's hard to pick one. But
I know that feeling.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if Cassandra's already been mentioned, but I personally am not poly, but I am a lesbian, and I really enjoy the fact that like Cassandra's so set. Like, I know she's like the goddess of truth and crap, but like she could step on me and I'd thank her, basically.
She could do what?
She could step on me and I'd thank her.
Oh.
And by that I mean like she's so like sure of herself. Like, I forget who was that she was like flirting with for a while, and then she straight up was like, I'm a lesbian, I have 2 partners, peace.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
that was it. Like that was all. I just like I think that representation is really important because she's just there's no hesitation.
Yeah. But she's also kind of a
She's
jerk.
so cool. I mean, like,
You know-
she's an asshole, but she's cool.
but yeah, that's a lot of the characters. There's with various characters, there's things that I admire, and there's things that I'm like, what's wrong with you? And she's one that, as stoic as she is, there's also a lot of feeling there that comes out in various ways, and yeah, excellent character.
My favorite by far would be Baphomet. I know he's a walking trash fire, but I kind of love my walking trash fire. The 2 characters I probably related to the most were Dionysus and Tara.
Okay.
Oh, she's got one right behind you, Ken.
You?
I'm super gay, but I like Sakmat. Speaking
okay.
no hesitation, I like how she just goes with it, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
as long as she has beer, she has sex, whatever.
Yeah.
And I was, being a person of color, I was so happy when I think Amatras, when she got killed. I was like, thank God, because there's always that one girl that just talks too much.
yes.
Especially, that white girl that just talk way too much,
Yeah. We were talking a little bit too earlier about her, and just like she just seemed like super fake sometimes, you know what I mean? Especially kind of like we were talking about in the beginning, where she had like the whole like cutesy thing, like, oh, I'm the boring one because I'm heterosexual. I'm like, I wanted to be like, bitch, please, come on now. You know what I mean? But yeah, and then Sakamet, yeah, I mean, with her being like just totally free. You know, I feel like she's like one of the pantheon that kind of like approached it the way that makes the most logical sense. It may not have been the best way in terms of like, okay, you now have powers. How can you improve humanity? You know what I mean? She definitely wasn't that, but she was like, fuck this, I'm getting as much ass as I can in the next 2 years. You know what I mean? She's like, I'm gonna live my life, you know? Like, originally her and Lucy definitely made a lot of sense together.
Well, and I mean, one thought I've had is like, these powers are thrust upon these people. They didn't ask for these powers.
Well, Lord did.
Do they have any requirement or responsibility to use them responsibly? I mean, you know, they didn't consent to this situation. So why should they be expected to, I mean, maybe, you know, don't ruin other people's lives, but you don't have to be heroes either, I don't, you know, necessarily. I mean, it'd be noble of you to be, but I don't, you know.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know. And it's interesting to, you know, it's an interesting mind game of like, to think about how you might respond in that situation, but honestly, I have how I think I'd respond, and who knows if it's anything like how to actually respond.
Yeah. That's kind of one of those things of like the whole like with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing, and that actually makes me think of before I say that, did anybody else want to talk about their favorite character? Okay.
You say that once I sit down.
So so with Ball, like we were starting to talk about before, the whole notion of, you know, okay, you have these powers. Do you have any type of responsibility? And if so, what is it? Because I know people in the audience are at, you know, various points in the story, and I apologize for somewhat of a spoiler, but I mean, I think it's pretty well known that like Ball's basically been murdering children. But he's doing it because he thinks that he has to in order to basically save the rest of humanity.
Well,
you know what I mean?
It's back to the lies Anarchy is telling them is you've got to make sacrifices. You got to do things in order to stop the darkness. And
yeah, and that just made me think, especially like towards the end. Like I won't ruin the ending, but you know. And then too, like if you go back and thinking about the Sakamet's character, like the dichotomy between the two of them, where she's like just completely free, just doing and living life however she wants to, and then the character of Ball, who is like basically taken the weight of like all of humanity on his shoulders. So, you know, when it's revealed that he's doing like this horrible thing, it's like, how do you really look at that? You know what I mean? It's like you have, and then too, like looking at Cass as a character, looking at Sakamet as a character, looking at Ball and his motivations and what he actually does, and then like looking at Woden and what he does, it's like, man, like, how do you even compare the two? Because it's like, Woden is obviously a trash person, but I mean, Ball's like killing kids, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, how do you even look at that? Like, do you look at the motivation behind their actions, or do you look at what their action is? You know what I mean?
And I think that answer, well, when you're reading a story, you can do both. I think when it comes to reality, I mean, and kind of in a way how I approach reading stories too, because I have the limitation of reality, ultimately you can never know someone's motivations. You can never know what's going on inside their head or what they're feeling. All you can really ever judge is their actions. And
but in this case, we know what he's feeling. We know what Ball is feeling. We know why he's doing what he's doing. So it's more of like a thought of like how we as the reader look at him as a character.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because like you said, admittedly, in certain instances, like in the world, outside of the pantheon, no one else knows why he's doing what he's doing. But as the reader, that's part of the benefit of getting to read stories. Like we get to know, like we know, so we have the ability to make that decision on how we feel, how we personally feel about his actions and what he's doing.
Yeah. And it can be a good exercise in yeah, kind of the looking at, I guess, motivations and misconceptions and how they can lead people to do various things.
And then how looking at those motivations can allow people to be manipulated, because I mean that happens
Yeah, well, and I mean
all the time in the real world too.
that is something to be said for him. Is the worst things he was doing? He was being severely manipulated, and so there is some, something to be said there for the conditions in which he was doing them.
Yeah, but it's a doubly hard question, because on the one hand it's kind of like, should he have tried to find another way? You know what I mean? Because that kind of like, that's part of the beauty of stories like this, and Brian K. Vaughan kind of writes like that too, where you're presented with these like very complex characters, these complex scenarios, and generally in a story, at some point there's like a moral that's being made, you know what I mean, and it gets pretty clearly defined in a story generally, but like here it's just not. Like, these things happen and you understand exactly why the characters are doing what they're doing. You get to see how the puzzle pieces or how the chess pieces are being moved around, but at the end of the day there's nothing there that tells you as the reader like, this is how you should feel about this, where like that's very different in my mind from like how traditional storytelling is done. Because like with Ball, at the end of the day you understand, yes, he's being manipulated, but it's kind of like, should he have tried harder to find another way? But then it's like, you have Cass's character and she tried so hard, she was like, this just does not make sense. And then Laura was like, you just spent 6 goddamn months trying to figure out what the hell's going on and you haven't done anything. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like, comparing Ball, where it's like he's making firm decisions and he's moving ahead, he's doing an action. And then you have Cassandra, where it's like, okay, she's trying to find all the information, but she's not actually getting anything done. So it's like, and you're just left with this feeling like, oh my God, I don't know who was right, who was wrong, like what the hell's going on here,
Well, and I that's one of the great things about the story, is no one's entirely right or entirely wrong.
But they don't tell you that. You know what I mean? It's like
yeah.
you just have to figure that out, like how you feel about it. He just like leaves it up to you. He's like, this is what happened. This is the story. You got to figure out how the hell you feel about it.
Yeah. One of the things we're winding down here. We talked some earlier about representation, and one of the things that I like that they did in the story is back with Cassandra, and something we find out in the story is that Cassandra is a trans character, is a trans woman, and on the podcast
I'm gonna shut the door. It's getting loud.
we've talked about various trans characters, and it's always interesting, various things. Like, for one thing, if a character is cis passing, which is by no means a benchmark that trans people should have to meet, but if they are, in a story, well, they have to be outed to the reader somehow. Mm-hmm. And this can be the same with gay characters as well. It's like, how are you outing them to the reader? And well, in this case, it's like, it's just one small part where Woden's being Woden, kind of being an asshole. And
yeah, that was the way that she's outed, trash that he is, basically trying to use it as like a manipulation tactic. But yeah, it's kind of hard in that respect, because on the one hand, just like with every other character, like we were talking about in the beginning, the subtlety of it being incredibly important, because then it just becomes about the characters and who they are. You're reading this story and you don't think of Cass, the trans woman. You just think of like Cass, the very like hard-hitting, like questioning type person. You think about her actions and her attributes as opposed to her identity. And with someone who is trans, that's kind of a hard thing to kind of juggle, because on the one hand, like in the real world, you know, for 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 those of us, for most of us interacting with them, it's kind of like a thing of like, it's not your business. But then at the same time, it's kind of like, well, how do you allow for that representation to happen? You know what I mean?
Well, and with her, it's handled really well in a lot of ways because, I mean, it's a part of who she is, but it doesn't define her for the reader. It's not the solely defining thing about her. Like it's a piece of how she's defined.
Yeah.
And also like that. Well, a lot of times when we see trans women presented, a lot of times we're seeing the hyper feminine trans woman, and I like how, you know, she's more butch, and because, you know, these variations exist in people, and, you know, again, stuff like that, like variation among trans people needs to be normalized for people who don't meet many trans people in their lives.
Yeah, I think part of the problem too, especially for, and then a lot of us who are cisgender probably don't even realize that we're doing it, like making these comparisons, you know, when we're regarding trans people about like how they, you know, compare, which is like a really shitty way to look at it, you know, to a cis person, you know what I mean? And in storytelling, that can be, you know, something very difficult to navigate. But you know, in this story, I think it's important that, you know, they have trans representation. But again, it becomes about her as a character, and that's kind of a hard thing too, because I mean, basically, to me, in my mind, she's cis passing.
Yeah.
So it's
Definitely.
kind of like, you know, as you read the story, that's kind of a hard one. But again, that just comes back to where it's just like really important to have varied types of representation, because sometimes it is really important, especially for, you know, cis folk, to understand, you know, what, like those pressures that we are putting on transgender people, because a lot of things that they have to do in their daily lives, you know, the burdens that they take on are not choices that they are making, they are burdens that we are putting on them.
Yeah.
You know, whether we realize it or not, you know. And so in the way that Cass is represented in this story, it's important, you know, for, you know, trans people reading the story to be able to feel like they're represented and things like that. But then it's also going to be important to seek out other works where, you know, a cis person reading this or reading a different work can kind of understand and get more of that impact
But
of how we're, you know.
Also, one of the things I think they did great with Cass overall. I mean, because she's a relatable character for a lot of people, and they didn't create a trans character in such a way that only trans people can relate to them. And I'm guessing that's probably impossible, because if a character is that much of a cliche, probably trans people don't relate to them either. But she's relatable on many other levels, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like we say with like any marginalized community, there's probably more diversity within a community than there are like across communities, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the black experience is not a monolith, the gay experience is not a monolith, and I'm sure the trans experience is not a monolith either.
Yeah. So, we're
Did anybody else have any
running
other?
out of time. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Is if anybody else had any thoughts, anything you loved about it, hated about it.
Anything else anybody wanted to say in general? Absolutely anything about the comic.
Oh, okay. Whatever. You can throw out Karen. It's okay. It won't hurt anybody.
Okay, what part of I don't throw didn't you get?
I'm like, she about to hurt you.
Throw it at me.
I really liked how they went about showing the Morgan and Baphomet's relationship, from like how we get it seeming like it's this super good relationship and we think he's the bad one, but then how it kind of twists and you get to see different aspects of an abusive relationship and codependence.
Yes.
And how they really dived into that, and the psychology of the victim and how they feel blamed and feel like they deserve it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh my
his,
gosh.
his
yeah.
journey in that codependence is, and well, I think we mentioned before you got here that, he's in this place where he's admitting that the relationship's a problem, and yet he's still staying there.
Yeah, because he's still struggling with it himself. And I kind of wonder too with the Morgan, you know, and her, because she basically is three people in one. I wonder if there was some deliberateness there, because I definitely do not have any type of, medical, psychological background or anything. But I wonder if that was kind of purposeful, you know what I mean? Where she has like these three distinct characters that are embodied in this one person and these three different personalities. I kind of wonder if that was purposeful and in a way that ties to their relationship and also her interactions with other people too. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
So I don't know if you guys watch The Good Place, but something I really love about that show
I'm behind, but I do love that.
It's exploring the ethics of what we owe to each other, and I appreciate that this story is a lot about what we owe to each other, either as humans or as gods, and I like how they explore that.
Yeah, me too. That's really good. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we close up? Alrighty. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate you being here and you sharing your time with us and talking with us about Wicked and Divine. Oh, and if you guys didn't pick it up, I am cosplaying as Persephone. And Tracy is, yes.
I've got a jacket. It's way too hot right now.
Yeah. But shout out to my girl Deborah. She did my hair and makeup. Yeah, and she's also Tracy was talking about the group we're in, Color Phantom. She's also part of the admin team, and she's gonna be on a panel on Monday at 11:30. If anyone is into The Walking Dead, she will school you on The Walking Dead on Monday.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed the panel, you can go on the app and leave us a rating. We'd love it
You
if
can
left
leave us 5
stars.
stars or nothing at all.
Also, if you want to hear more of us, we have, about 20 episodes on our podcast now?
Is it?
Actually, I think we're more
like
than that,
25, 26,
Yeah,
something in there.
and so we've got our social media information up here, website, where you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and all that.
Yeah, because this one's going to be kind of like winding down season 2 for us. Yeah. Yep, but yeah. So like we mentioned before, we love talking about indie comics. So if that's your jam, you're into that, which of course you are because you're here. So, yep.
And we really appreciate you coming out.
Yep.